George, you do know how to tell a war story. Oh, hello. You must forgive me. I was reading my journal of General George Washington from his campaign in the Ohio River Valley against the dirty French he's fighting there. Forgive my ignorance there. But welcome to the library, where all things historical are kept and learned. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not British. I'm clearly an American. There's nothing even in the pipe. But that is General George Washington's journal. That's kind of cool, huh? You're not here to talk about George Washington, though. You're not here to talk about me pretending to be English. You're here for a story of the English Civil War. And not just the English Civil War, but how the English Civil War affected the American colony. But first, I know some of you might not know what the English Civil War is, so here I'll give you just a quick background. And it's going to be kind of like a lightning quick summary. I'm no European historian. I took AP Euro in high school, and I got a 4 out of 5 on the exam, so I'm kind of an expert as it is. But really, so the English Civil War, it starts with a guy, King Charles I. Now, King Charles I, by all accounts, was a good guy in person and on personal affairs, but as a ruler, he was kind of stuck up. I mean, it makes sense, though. King Charles I was an absolutist ruler. He's told from birth that God has put him on earth to be the ruler of a country. So he's going to, say, well, God gave me this position, and who are you to say what I can and can't do? And that will be ever clear in the coming years. From about 1629 to 1640, Charles kind of acts without parliament. And the reason is way back when, he looked at something called the ship tax. What the ship tax was, also known as ship money, was simply the name of the tax, was a tax that was placed on coastal towns and cities for merchants and fishermen and the like. And what Charles did is say, hey, it's just a tax. I can change it to make everyone have it. Why not? And that's what he did. And Parliament, of course, was a little peeved by this. Parliament thought he was abusing his power and said, hey, Charles, you can't really do that. You're supposed to come to us if you're going to change anything. Charles said, it's simply just a tax. Why is that such a big deal? So in response to King Charles' actions, Parliament releases something called the Petition of Right in 1628. And what the Petition of Right is it's a petition, or really a declaration, but without using the word declaration, of people's wishes. It's Parliament telling the king how they feel, but not to the king directly. They're not saying, King Charles, you're abusing power and you should, be aware of that. It's more of, hey, King Charles, there are people below you who are kind of abusing their power, and we think you should stop them doing that. And that's when Charles goes off on his own, as I mentioned earlier, governing from about 1629 to 1640 without Parliament's direction or aid. But then in 1640, there's something called the Short Parliament. King Charles finally decides that he will look to Parliament for help after some petitions, and he asks them to do something, and they refuse. So what does he do? He dismisses Parliament. He tells them to go home. He tells Parliament to just straight up go home. And he calls for a new election. So there's a new election, and there's a new Parliament. This one's called the Long Parliament. King Charles does the same thing. He asks for their help and their assistance in something, but they refuse. Same thing happens. He tells them to go home. But this time, Parliament doesn't go home. They refuse him and are, in essence, rebelling against the king. This draws the boundaries and the lines that will form the English Civil War. On one side, you have the Cavaliers, and on the other, you have the Roundheads. The Roundheads are the rebels, led by Oliver Cromwell. The Cavaliers are those who are in support of King Charles I and eventually II. With these boundaries drawn, things sort of come to a head. Oliver Cromwell elects the Rump Parliament. Now, the Rump Parliament is just a continuation of the Long Parliament, but this Parliament, the Rump Parliament, is those only loyal to Oliver Cromwell. Way across the pond in America, things are also happening. It's easy to forget when studying the English Civil War that England does have overseas colonies. I mean, Roanoke is founded in like the late 1580s or the early 1580s, even though it fails. Jamestown is settled in 1607, Plymouth in 11 or something like that. I can never remember Plymouth years, but it's not that important, right? It's not like I have a history YouTube channel that I should know this information for. Anyway, so meanwhile, all this is happening in the American colonies. There's some divisions being created as well. Clearly, everyone living there was formerly an English person. Most of the colonies remain loyal to the crown, Virginia especially, so much so that it's got the nickname the Old Dominion State because it was loyal to the crown during the English Civil War. Now, the Rump Parliament has something called the Interregnum, which is their sort of war against the American colonies who were siding with the crown and not them. Because of this, they passed something called, and I'm going to read it off my screen over there because it's like a really long title and I don't remember the whole name of it, an act for prohibiting trade with Barbados, Virginia, Bermuda, and... So with that act passed, they're already limiting trade with the American colonies. One could argue you're setting up like a pretty bad situation if you have colonies that could at any moment just like be, hey, we're not you anymore, we're just our own thing. But, you know, I guess they'll learn that lesson later in the 1700s. So trade is prohibited with Virginia, but Maryland, the colony just north of it, is having its own issues, and something called the plundering time. So basically what happens next is a series of violent interactions between the Calvert forces and the Claiborne forces. And the Calverts are loyal to the crown, whereas Claiborne is loyal to the Rump Parliament. And there's a city called St. Mary's City in Maryland that's since been reconstructed, and put a picture here or something. And that in Kent Island in the Chesapeake Bay is going to be the scene of some of this early aggressive maneuvers between the two sides. St. Mary's City is retaken once and twice by the Calverts, and then Kent Island is retaken and fought over, and then this leads to a naval engagement between the two sides at the Pocomoke River, at the mouth of the Pocomoke River in the Chesapeake Bay. But all that said, the real fight hasn't even begun yet. What happens on the western shore of Maryland, north of St. Mary's City, in the town of Annapolis, or where Annapolis will later be, is going to be the bloodiest clash of the English Civil War in the Americas. It's called the Battle of the Severn. So shortly after all this violence is occurring on Kent Island and in St. Mary's City, there's a little settlement called Providence, which is founded and settled. And that is where Annapolis is today. There's this ship called the Golden Lion. A guy called Roger Heeman is the one who pilots it. It's his ship, really. And he comes back to Maryland and settles in Providence. After a while, the war's still raging on at home, and now, on the American front, there's a rumor really, that gets passed down into Providence, that loyalists, those loyal to the crown from Virginia, are coming to kill men from Providence. Really just massacre the whole city. So at this, Roger Heeman helps oversee the evacuation of the women and children of Providence. Then, he sails out into the Chesapeake. Meanwhile, a war council on his ship, the Golden Lion, is held, and they elect a guy called William Fuller. William Fuller is made a captain of a militia regiment, essentially. He was really just called Captain Fuller by most people, but his full name is William Fuller. So by all accounts, Fuller and his men are preparing the town of Providence for an attack. An attack which does... So Heeman has his ship in the Severn River, right off of Annapolis and near Baltimore. All of a sudden, loyalist ship roll up in the Severn River, and what does Heeman do? He fires on them, of course. So there's a naval engagement going on the Severn River. Meanwhile, on land, Captain Fuller manages to get the only Commonwealth of England flag in the entire colony to use as his regimental colors, which is probably going to be a pretty huge feat, seeing as it's the only one in the entire colony of Maryland that he manages to find and use for his regimental colors. He goes to a place called Horn Point, which is now in Annapolis. It still is there to this day. He and his forces meet the Loyalist forces, and within a half an hour of battle, Fuller manages to kill 17 of the Loyalist forces, while only losing 2 in battle. Of course, Fuller is not satisfied, and he executes 4 more of the Loyalist forces upon their capture and retreat. Fuller wins the day. Out at sea, the Severn really, the river, out at river, Heeman manages to get the Loyalist ships to retreat and fall back to Spa Creek. There he bottles them up and bars their escape. He's able to capture them as well. Now, I know there's a lot of build-up for this, but this is about all that is known about the Battle of the Severn. I know I made a big deal about the build-up and all this time spent explaining the English Civil War and some of the stuff behind it, but this is really the extent of the battle, and it's a really bloody battle for that time, lasting only 30 minutes. I mean, there are 30-minute battles with with more consequence that are less bloody. So with conflict over in the Americas, so was it in England. The Loyalists had retained power. Oliver Cromwell's head is probably sitting on a spike somewhere across the sea, and all is happy. I wish there was some kind of connection that I could make if I was a more learned and skilled historian of Battle of the Severn and the English Civil War in America to the Revolution, even if I could, or just later history in the United States, but really it has no major effect. It's just sort of like this quip of local history in Annapolis that I didn't even learn in Annapolis. I read it on Wikipedia. I was just like, Wikipedia has this cool feature. It used to work for me, now it doesn't, where it shows you nearby things, and the Battle of the Severn came up when I was driving through Annapolis like 2 years ago, and I was like, this is insane. Why does no one talk about this? And that is a lot of stuff that I find interesting, is the stuff that no one ever talks about, or stuff that's so obscure or small that it's just relegated to the footnotes of history. And I think the Battle of the Severn, being kind of an influential thing during the English Civil War years, has no bearing on American history as some grand picture. That doesn't mean it's not important. And I think that's the point of history. You can look at things as individual events, or just look at an individual event that has literally no connection to anything at all, and it's still interesting, and it's still an important story to tell. So if you like those stories, I ask of you one thing. Please like the video, subscribe, and stay tuned for more. Thanks, everyone. Read a book. Read a book. I got plenty if you want to borrow one. Read a book.